Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. If you visited the museum lately, you might just notice that there's a lot of missing parts. Just look at this memorial to Edgar Allan Poe. The statue's missing a toe. Wherever you look, you'll find little bits and pieces that are missing. Take a look at this letter from James Russell Lowell, a poet and editor, to Poe's boss Thomas White. It's missing the signature. Somebody at some point cut it out, pasted it into an album, sold it separately, who knows. We actually have a whole album packed full of these clipped signatures from different letters. They're clipped back in the 1840s before anybody realized maybe we should have saved the whole thing, not just the signature. In fact, right here's a clipped signature of magazine editor George Pope Morris, edited the Evening Mirror, where Poe published The Raven. And here's roughly half or a third of a letter that Francis Sargent Osgood wrote to Poe's enemy Elizabeth Elliot, saying, "Stop spreading those rumors about Poe and me." Elliot herself cut off part of the letter and then crossed out some of the lines on the back of it to keep us from finding out what all she was accused of doing. So tonight, we're going to take a look at some of the partial Poe letters in the collection in the Curator's Crypt. So here is half a letter that Poe wrote to his enemy, Rufus W. Griswold. You can just see the last part of Griswold's name right there and the last part of his address. And of course, a little stamp that says the postage was paid. And it's apparently cut off right here, right down the middle of the address. And this is what's on the other side. It's Poe's autobiography, sent to Rufus Griswold for inclusion in Griswold's new book, The Poets and Poetry of America. So apparently Griswold cut this paper in half, printed this part in his book, and saved the rest for later. Both pieces of the letter stayed in Griswold's family and were passed down all the way to his grandchildren. And those grandchildren split up the halves. The letter half of the letter went to the Boston Public Library. The good part, the autobiography, came here to the Poe Museum. So at least we know where both the halves are, and we can reconstruct them digitally. We know how they fit together. But now I'm going to show you a letter we can't do that with because a good 3/4 of it are completely missing. Right down here. Mrs. Rosewell Page gave this to the museum in 1969. It originally belonged to her brother-in-law, the novelist, diplomat, politician, Thomas Nelson Page. And it looks like it came from maybe the bottom right quadrant of a letter. There's nothing on the back indicating who Poe wrote it to, so all we're left with is this little text right here. And it's missing a whole lot. That looks like Burr, maybe October, maybe September, November, probably a month with a burr, but who knows, could be another word with a burr at the end. This line reads, "There could be no impropriety in letting the commencement of volume 2, the editorial," then it stops again, "have devolved upon myself and blank. You allude to or my own. I, blank, with your approbation of my labors, blank, would be very glad to hear from you, blank. I believe you have some little acquaintance, blank, brother W.H.L. Poe of Baltimore. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Edgar A. Poe." So that doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but What can we discern just from this fragment? First of all, he mentions taking over the editorial of the magazine with Volume 2. That magazine would have to be the Southern Literary Messenger here in Richmond. And Volume 2 began with the December 1835 issue, which was available right around November 26, 1835, and continued on through the end of 1836. So the letter was written sometime between November 1835 and the end of 1836. I lean towards maybe the beginning of 1836, because he mentions taking over the editorial business, writing all the reviews. But by the April 1836 issue, he was getting at least some help writing some of the reviews. Nathaniel Beverly Tucker wrote a review for the April 1836 issue. So let's say this could be right around March of 1836. Who's the recipient? We don't really know. But we do know about them. They like Poe's works. Apparently, Poe is thanking them for complimenting his works that he's published in the magazine. But that doesn't really narrow it down, because Poe has been writing for the magazine since March of 1835. So about potentially a year's worth of poetry, short stories, reviews, everything from horror stories like Morella and Berenice, to science fiction like Hans Pfaall, to comedies like Loss of Breath and King Pest. A lot of poetry, but tons of reviews. So we can't narrow it down based just on that. But he does also mention W.H.L. Poe, which is, of course, Poe's brother, William Henry Leonard Poe of Baltimore. So the recipient probably lived in Baltimore, maybe was still living in Baltimore at the time Poe wrote this letter, and was acquainted at least with Poe's brother, who died on August 1st, 1831. So somebody who was living in Baltimore right around 1831 or earlier. People have proposed a few different names here. One is Lambert A. Wilmer. It's a possibility. Another one is F.W. Thomas, who actually was one of Poe's friends. They became lifelong correspondents. Poe wrote lots of letters to this guy. And it's said that F.W. Thomas initiated their correspondence right around March of 1836 in a letter that's now missing. We don't know what it says. Maybe, just maybe, our little fragment is a piece of Poe's response to Thomas's first letter to him. All speculation, of course, but that's all we have. So why don't you take one last look at this letter and find out if there's any other clues we can find to its complete content. And if you out there have the rest of the letter, or at least another part of it, let us know so we can reunite the pieces. And if you'd like to help the Poe Museum preserve precious Poe pieces like these, why not become a patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. And if you'd like to become a member of the museum, just sign up at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.